Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How are you guys doing? Let's give it another minute or two and see who else will be joining us. So, is the free page maximum for Simon set in stone, my reference? No, you go above. So, like I said in class, um, there's no page limit. I only add that to enforce people to actually write something. But you can write as many pages as you wish. There is no page limit. So, for today's lecture, we will be talking about is 3 to 4 okay? Yes, that is perfect. So, last week we talked about the inner planets, the terrestrial worlds. The first part of today's lecture, we will be talking about the outer solar system. So, in essence, that is Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. So, this is the beautiful planet Jupiter. So, who of you have looked into a telescope towards Jupiter? Okay, so one hand. So Jupiter is the largest object in our solar system besides the sun that we can monitor. And in this image, we can clearly see Jupiter's red eye. You know, guys, know what Jupiter's red eye is? Yes, that is a storm. So on Earth, the tropical storms, we get cyclones and hurricanes. It's exactly the same thing, but only much, much, much bigger. And it is continuing on for thousands of years. So this red eye storm, you can fit 4 Earths in there to give you a perspective. And then who have seen Saturn through a telescope or binoculars. So Saturn is one of the beautiful objects we can see, especially when you see its rings. Then which planet is this? This is Uranus. You are correct. And this planet? Neptune. Right. So, something interesting worth remember our magnitude scale that we can see. If you look at Uranus, Uranus is just above, oh, not above, sorry, just below magnitude 6. It's 5.9 something. So that is the ultimate limit of the human eye. So if you have very good eyesight and on a very clear night with perfect atmospheric conditions, some people can see Uranus with your unaided eye. But Neptune, you need binoculars or a telescope to see Neptune. And then what is this object? Yes, that is Pluto. So for this lecture, we are going to answer 4 important questions. And those questions are, what are the properties of the Jovian world? So remember, the innermost planets are called terrestrial worlds, and the outer planets is called Jovian worlds after Jupiter. And secondly, what is the evidence that some moons in the outer solar system has been geologically active? Thirdly, how are planetary rings formed and maintained? And then lastly, what do Pluto and the other Kuiper Belt objects tell us about the formation of the solar system? So last week we talked about the sulfuric acid clouds on Venus and how strange that is, and that the terrestrial planets have solid surfaces. But the Jovian worlds is a bit different, and they have no solid surfaces. So the worlds of the outer solar system can be studied from Earth, but much of what astronomers now know has been radioed back to Earth from space probes. And the Pioneer and Voyager missions flew past the outer planets in the 1970s and 1980s. And Galileo spacecraft orbited Jupiter in the late 1990s, and the Cassini and Huygens orbiter and Pluto arrived at Saturn in 2004. And the New Horizons craft flew past Pluto in 2015 and is now sailing deeper into the Kuiper Belt. Juno arrived in orbit around Jupiter in 2016 for a planned multi-year close-up investigation of the planet's magnetosphere and gravity field. Throughout the discussion, you will find images and data returned by those robotic explorers. So, looking at Greek mythology, who is Juno? Juno is Jupiter's wife. And a lot of Jupiter's moons has been named after Jupiter's lovers. So it's actually quite funny. They actually sent Juno to check up on Jupiter, which is funny in astronomy terms. But that's just a different side note. So the outermost planets we got a system is Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And we refer to them as the Jovian worlds. And Jovian worlds meaning they resemble Earth. So one thing to take note is Pluto is not part of this list anymore. So Pluto was discovered in 1930 and was a planet until 2006. but was reclassified by the IAU, so the International Astronomical Union, in 2006 as a dwarf planet. But in this lecture, we will learn some of the characteristics. So here we can see a artist's representation of these planets. And here we can see an image of one of Jupiter's moons transiting in front of it. So we start out with the atmospheres and interiors of the Jovian planet. So the Jovian planet has hydrogen-rich atmosphere filled with clouds. We can see through a small telescope the cloud formations on Jupiter and Saturn. So you can also see the clouds from stripes and bands that circle each planet, known as the belt zone circulation. And you will find traces of the same types of features on Uranus and Neptune, but they are less distinct. So models based on observations indicate that the atmospheres of the Jovian planets are not very deep. For example, Jupiter's atmosphere makes up only about 1% of its radius. Below their atmospheres, Jupiter and Saturn are mostly liquid, so the conventional term for these planets, gas giants, should probably change. Uranus and Neptune are sometimes called ice giants because they contain abundant water in solid forms. Only near their centers do the Jovian planets have cores of dense material with the composition of rock and metal, but none of the Jovian worlds has a definite solid surface on which you could walk. So you can't really land your spaceship on the Jovian worlds, but you may be able to land on one of their moons. All of the Jovian worlds have extensive satellite systems, and those moons can be classified into two groups. One is regular satellites, which tend to be large and orbit relatively close to their parent planet, with low inclinations to the planet's equator, moving in the prograde direction along with most of the objects in a solar system, versus the irregular satellites, which tend to be smaller than the regular satellites, sometimes have retrograde or highly inclined orbits, and are generally far from their parent planet. And astronomers have evidence that irregular satellites formed approximately where they are now as the planets formed, but that the irregular satellites are mostly, if not all, captured objects. So what is meant with regular satellites and regular orbits is everything orbits around, um, if you're looking from the system from above, it orbits in a counterclockwise direction. And if it's a irregular satellite, it orbits in a clockwise direction. So, the interesting question for you guys. If you are in an ice skating ring, which way do you go around the ring? Clockwise or anti-clockwise? Yes, anti-clockwise. If you look at athletics, especially your 400, 800 and longer distance athletes, which direction do they run around the track? Yes, also anti-clockwise. If you look at car races such as NASCAR in the US, which way do they drive around the track? Yes, anti-clockwise. So I ask you now, why do humans always want to go around things in the anti-clockwise direction? Well, that's also a question too, an answer I don't have. But it's just something interesting to take note of. So you can read up about it. But yes, all of your normal regular satellites in normal regular orbit, you orbit in a anti-clockwise direction. And what we'll also learn is some of the Jovian moons are geologically active currently as we speak, while others show signs of that they were active in the past. Of course, geological activity depends on how heat flows from the interior, so you might ponder what could be heating inside those small objects. So let's first start off with Jupiter. So Jupiter is the largest and most massive of the Jovian planets, and also the massive of all the planets combined. So it contains 71% of all the planetary matter in the solar system. Just as he used Earth, the largest of his terrestrial planets, as the basis for comparison with the others, you can examine Jupiter in detail as a standard in your comparative study of the Jovian planets. So although Jupiter is very large, it is only 1.3 times denser than water. For comparison, Earth is more than 5.5 denser than water. And as you have already learned that the density of the planet is an important clue about the average composition of the planet's interior. So Jupiter's shape also gives information about its interior. Jupiter and the other Jovian planets are all slightly flattened. A world with a large rocky core and a mantle will not be flattened much by rotation, but an all-liquid planet would flatten significantly. This Jupiter's oblateness, so the fraction by which its equatorial diameter exceeds its polar diameter, combined with its average density, helps astronomers calculate what its insides is like. So models showed that the interior of Jupiter is mostly liquid hydrogen. However, if you jumped into Jupiter carrying a kayak, expecting the ocean, you would be disappointed. The base of the atmosphere is so hot and the pressure is so high that there is no sudden boundary between liquid and a gas. As you fall deeper and deeper through the atmosphere, you would find the gas density increasing around you until you were sinking through a liquid, but you would never splash into a distinct liquid surface. Under very high pressure, liquid hydrogen becomes liquid metallic hydrogen, a material that is a very good conductor of electricity, and model calculations indicate that most of Jupiter's interior is composed of this material. That large mass of conducting liquid, stirred by convection currents and stunned by the planet's rapid rotation, drives the dynamo effect and generates a powerful magnetic field. So Jupiter's field is over 10 times stronger Earth's magnetic field. So the planet's magnetic field deflects the solar wind and dominates a volume of space around a planet called the magnetosphere. Jupiter's magnetosphere is 100 times larger than Earth's. And if you could see it in the sky, it would be more than 5 times larger than the full moon. Just as the case of Earth, interactions between Jupiter's magnetic field and the solar winds generate powerful electric currents that flow around a planet's magnetic poles. And these are visible at ultraviolet wavelengths as rings of aurora lights that are larger in diameter than Earth. So here we can see the magnetic field of Jupiter, and here we can see Jupiter's aurora lights. The strong magnetic field around Jupiter traps charged particles from the solar wind in radiation belts, 1 billion times more intense than the Van Allen belts that surround Earth. The spacecraft that have flown through these regions received over 4,000 times the radiation that would have been lethal for a human. At Jupiter's center, a so-called rocky core contains heavier elements such as iron, nickel, silicon, and so on, with a temperature 4 times hotter than the surface of the Sun and a pressure of 50 million times Earth's sea level atmospheric pressure. So this material is unlike any rock on Earth. The term rocky core refers to the chemical composition, not to the mechanical properties of the material. So careful measurements of the heat flowing out of Jupiter reveal that it emits about twice as much energy as it absorbs from the Sun. And this energy appears to be heat left over from the formation of the planet. So in chapter 15, you saw that Jupiter should have grown very hot when it formed, and some of that heat remains inside, slowly leaking into space. Look back at figure 5.17b. The infrared image of Jupiter required by the SOFIA Airborne Telescope shows a white stripe where the planet's internal heat is prominent in. In 2016, the Juno probe began orbiting Jupiter on a path coming within 4,200 kilometers of the cloud tops, making detailed measurements of the planet's magnetosphere and gravity field for insight into its internal structure. It is a common misconception that Jupiter is a ball of gases. In fact, you have learned Jupiter is mostly entirely a liquid planet. Its atmosphere is only a thin outer skin of turbulent gases and clouds. And the processes you will find there are repeated in slightly different ways on the other Jovian worlds. So notice 4 important ideas. So the atmosphere is hydrogen-rich, and the clouds are confined to a shallow layer. Secondly, the cloud layers are located at certain temperatures within the atmosphere where ammonia, ammonium hydrosulfide, and water respectively can condense. Thirdly, the belt zone circulation pattern of colored cloud bands circling the planet, like stripes on a child's ball, is related to the high and low pressure areas found in Earth's atmosphere. And then fourthly, the large circular or oval spots seen in Jupiter's clouds are circulating storms that can remain stable for decades or even centuries. Photos of Jupiter led to the common misconception that the clouds are at the top of the atmosphere. Realize that the atmosphere of transparent hydrogen and helium extends high above the cloud tops. So what you see in photos is only the cloud layers. And then Jupiter also has moons. So Jupiter has 4 large moons and at least 60 small moons. So this textbook is outdated. So it's 4 large moons. And the last time I checked, Jupiter had 84 confirmed moons in total. So a lot more than the 4 large moon is 60, so about 20 more. So larger telescopes and modern techniques are continually finding more small moons orbiting all the Jovian planets. And each of the Jovian planets probably has many more small undiscovered moons. And some of the small moons are probably captured asteroids. In contrast, the 4 largest moons of Jupiter, called the Gillian moons. So this is a hint for the exam. If I ask what are the Gillian moons after Galileo, are clearly related to each other and almost certainly formed within Jupiter. So when we look at the Gillian moons from left to right, we have Europa, Ganymede, Callisto. So here's Earth for comparison. So here, this Earth for comparison. So here we have Europa, Earth's moon, Ganymede, and Callisto. So the outermost Gillian moons is Ganymede and Callisto, and are about the size of Mercury, 1.5 times the size of Earth's moon. In fact, Ganymede is the largest moon in the solar system, and Ganymede and Callisto have low densities of only 1.9 and 1.8 grams per cubic centimeter, respectively, meaning they must consist roughly of half rock and half ice. And observations of the gravitational fields by the Galileo spacecraft reveal that Ganymede has a rocky or metallic core and lower density icy exterior, so is differentiated. Callisto is apparently only partly differentiated, and both moons interact with Jupiter's magnetic field in ways that show they probably have mineral-rich layers of liquid water 100 kilometers or more below its icy crust. Callisto's surface and most of Ganymede's surface appear old because they are heavily cratered and very dark, and a continuous blast of meteorites evaporates surface ice, leaving behind embedded minerals to form a dark skin like the Grimsey crust on an old snowbank. This icy surfaces get darker with age, and more recent impacts dig up cleaner ice craters. As you can see on the Callisto figure 18.3, and Ganymede has some younger, brighter groove terrain believed to be systems of faults in the brittle crust. And some sets of grooves overlap other sets of grooves, suggesting extended episodes of geological activity. So in the image on the left, we can see a visual enhanced contrast image. And this contrast enhanced visual wavelength image of Ganymede shows the frosty poles at the top and bottom, an old dark terrain and a brighter groove terrain. In image B, we can see a band of bright terrain on Ganymede run from lower left to upper right, and a collapsed area, a possible caldera, that lies at a center in visual wavelength image. Calderas form when subsurface liquid has drained away, and the bright areas contain other features associated with the flooding by water. The density of the next moon inward is Europa as 3 grams per cubic centimeter, which means that Europa is mostly rock with a thin icy crust. The visible surface is very clean ice, contains very few craters and long cracks in the icy crust, and includes complicated terrain that resembles blocks of ice in the Arctic Ocean. The pattern of mountain-like folds on the surface suggests that the icy crust breaks as the moon is flexed by tides from Jupiter. So Europa's gravitational influence on the Galileo spacecraft reveals that a liquid water ocean, perhaps 200 kilometers deep, lies below the 10 to 100 kilometer thick crust. The lack of craters that tells you Europa is an active world, whereas craters are quickly erased. So question, sir, should we know the depths of the planets and their moons? No, you don't need to know that at all. Don't need to know densities or anything. That's just background information. So in image A, we can see the icy surface of Europa. So one thing is, we know and have detected below the crust of Europa, there is a liquid body, and due to gravitational interactions with Jupiter, that causes tidal shifts. We know that that water is heated up. So one of the theories is, if we are looking for other life in the solar system, so talking about other life, microbial life, it could be in the oceans on Europa. But the question is, how do we get to that ocean? Because even though we can land on the crust, we still need to dig a couple of kilometers before we can get to the ocean. So that is a problem, but NASA is currently working on that. So images from spacecraft reveal that Io, the innermost of the 4 Gillian moons, has over 100 volcanic vents on its surface. And active volcanoes throw sulfur-rich gas and ash high above the surface. That ash falls back to bury the surface at a rate of a few millimeters a year. This explains why you see no impact craters on Io. They have covered up as fast as they form. And Io's density is 3.6 grams per cubic centimeter, showing that it's composed of rock and metal. Its gravitational influence on the passing Galileo spacecraft reveal that it is differentiated into a large metallic core, a rocky mantle, and low-density crust. So in this image, we can see these plumes from volcanoes on Io. So the activity you see in the Gideon moons must be driven by energy flowing outward. Yet these objects are too small to have remained hot from the time of their formation. So Io's volcanism seemed to be driven by tidal heating. Io follows a slightly elliptical orbit caused by its interactions with the other moons. As Io's distance from Jupiter varies, the planet's gravitational field flexes the moon with varying tidal force, and resulting friction heats Io's interior. The heat flowing outward causes the volcanism. Europa is not as active as Io, but it also must have at least a heat source, presumably tidal heating. Ganymede is no longer active, but when it was younger, it must have had internal heat to break the crust and produce the grooved terrain. In fact, those three moons are linked together in orbital resonance. Io orbits Jupiter 4 times, while Europa orbits twice and Ganymede once. These resonances keep all three orbits slightly elliptical and drive tidal heating that makes the moons active now, or made them active in the past. Distant Callisto is not caught in this orbital resonance and appears never to have been strongly active. Given the lack of surface activity, it is surprising there is evidence of a subsurface ocean with Callisto as well as Europa and Ganymede. One thing is that you guys don't realize is Jupiter has rings as well. So astronomers has known for centuries that Saturn has rings, but Jupiter's rings was not discovered until 1979, when the Voyager 1 spacecraft sent back photos. So less than 1% as bright as Saturn's icy rings. Jupiter's rings are very dark and reddish, showing that material is rocky rather than icy. Astronomers can also conclude that the ring particles are mostly microscopic. Photos of the ring show that it is very bright when illuminated from behind, called forward scattering. Large particles do not scatter light forward. A ring filled with a basketball-sized particles will look dark when illuminated from behind. Forward scattering tells you that Jupiter's rings are made of tiny grains of diameters approximately equal to the wavelengths of light, less than a millionth of a meter, about the size of particles in cigarette smoke. So when looking at infra wavelength, we can see Jupiter's rings around it. So the rings orbit inside the Roche limit, the distance from a planet within which a moon cannot hold itself together by its own gravity. If a moon were to come inside the Roche limit, tidal forces would overcome the moon's gravity and pull the moon apart. Also, raw material for a moon cannot coalesce inside the Roche limit. The Roche limit is about 2.4 times the planet's radius, depending on somewhat on the relative densities of the planet and the orbiting material. So the rings of Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune lie inside the respective Roche limits of each planet. Now you can understand Jupiter's dusty rings. If a dust speck gets knocked loose from a larger rock inside a Roche limit, the rock's gravity cannot hold the dust speck. For that same reason, billions of dust specks in the rings can't pull themselves together to make a moon because of tidal forces inside the Roche limit. You can be sure that Jupiter's ring particles are not old. The pressure of sunlight and the planet's powerful magnetic field can quickly alter the orbits of the particle images, show faint ring material extending downward to the cloud tops, evidently dust specks spiraling towards Jupiter. Dust is also lost from the ring as electromagnetic effects force it out of the central plane to form a low-density halo above and below the ring. Another reason the ring particles can't be old is that the intense radiation around Jupiter tends to grind the particles down to nothing into a century or so. Therefore, the ring you see today can't be material left over its current situation since the formation of Jupiter. Instead, the ring must be continuously resupplied with new dust. Observations made by the Galileo spacecraft provide evidence that a source of the ring material is meteoroids, eroding the small moons Andresta, Metis, Amalthea, and Thebe that are near or within the rings. The rings around Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune are also known to be short-lived. Question. So for the exam, it is all the chapters, or will there be a scope for which chapters to do? It will be all the chapters, chapter 1 to chapter 20 for the exam. The rings around Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune are also known to be short-lived. So they are also must be resupplied by new material, probably eroded from nearby moons. Aside from supplying the Jovian planet rings with particles, moons also act to confine the rings, keep them from spreading outward, and alter their shapes. So you will explore these processes in detail when you study the rings of the other planets. So what is the history of Jupiter? Can you put all of the evidence together and tell the story of Jupiter? Creating such a logical argument of evidence and hypothesis is the ultimate goal of planetary astronomy. Jupiter formed far enough from the Sun to incorporate large numbers of icy planetesimals. It must have grown rapidly. Once it was about 15 times or more massive than the Earth, it would grow by gravitational collapse, capturing gas directly from the solar nebula. It grew rich in hydrogen and helium from the solar nebula. Its present composition resembles the composition of the Sun and the solar nebula, so Jupiter's gravity is strong enough to hold onto all its gases, even hydrogen. The large family of moons may be mostly captured asteroids, and Jupiter may still encounter a wandering asteroid or comet now and then. Some of these are deflected, and some, like Comet Schumacher-Levy 9 that struck Jupiter in 1994, actually fall into the planet. Dust blasted off the inner moons by meteoroid impact settles into the equatorial plane from Jupiter's ring. The 4 Gillian moons are large and seem to have formed like a mini solar system in a disk of gas and dust around the forming planet. The innermost Gillian moon, Io, is densest, and the densiest of the other decreases as you move away from Jupiter, similar to the way densities of the planets decrease with the distance from the Sun. Perhaps the inner moons incorporated less ice because they formed closer to the heat of the growing planet. You can recognize that tidal heating also has been important. An intense heating of the inner moons could have driven off much of their ices. A combination of two processes, may be responsible for the compositions of the Gillian moons. Now we need to talk about Saturn. So Saturn is the most famous for its beautiful rings, easily visible through the telescopes of modern astronomers. Large Earth-based telescopes have explored the planets for many decades. The first close-up views came from when 2 Voyager probes flew past Saturn in 1980 and 1989, and the Cassini spacecraft went into orbit around Saturn in 2004 and began an extended exploration of the planet, its rings and its moons. So as you can see in figure 18.1, Saturn shows only faint belt zone circulation. But Voyager, Cassini, and Hubble space telescopes image confirm that belts and zones are present and that the associated winds are up to 3 times faster than the winds on Jupiter. Belts and zones on Saturn are less visible than on Jupiter because they occur deeper in Saturn's colder atmosphere, below a layer of methane gas. So if we look at Saturn, you see these bands going around it. Those are the band circle that we are talking about. So Saturn is less dense than water, so it would float on water. Suggesting that it's like Jupiter, a rich hydrogen and in helium, and Saturn is the most oblate of the planets. And its evidence suggests that its interior is mostly liquid with only a small core of heavy elements. Because its internal pressure is lower, Saturn has less liquid metallic hydrogen than Jupiter. Perhaps that is why Saturn's magnetic field is 20 times weaker than Jupiter's. Like Jupiter, Saturn radiates more energy than it receives from the Sun, and models predict that it too has a very hot interior. Saturn has nearly 15 known moons, many of which are small and all of which contain mixtures of ice and rock, and many are probably captured objects. The largest of Saturn's moons is Titan, a bit larger than the planet Mercury. Measurements of the effect of its gravitational field on its probes passing nearby indicated it has a rocky core on the think mantle of Isis. Titan is so cold that its gas molecules do not travel fast enough to escape. It has an atmosphere composed of mostly nitrogen, with traces of argon and methane, and the ultraviolet component of the sunlight converts some of the methane into complex carbon-rich molecules that collect into small particles, filling the atmosphere with orange smog. Some of those particles evidently settle downward and coat parts of the surface with what has been described as organic goo, meaning it is composed of carbon-rich molecules and is probably semi-liquid. So here we can see the images of Titan taken by the Huygens probe. The Cassini spacecraft dropped the Huygens probe into an atmosphere of Titan. Huygens found, as expected, that Titan's surface is composed mainly of ices of water and methane. That is a wrong. I will fix that in the slides, but that should be a negative temperature. So images made by the descending probe showed dark drainage channels, suggesting that liquid methane falls as rain, washes the dark goo off the higher terrain, and rains into the lowlands. So such methane downpours may be rare. However, no direct evidence of liquid methane was detected as the probe descended, but later radar images made by the Cassini orbiter have detected what appear to be lakes, presumably containing liquid methane. Infrared images suggest that the presence of methane volcanoes that replenish the methane in the atmosphere. So Titan must have some internal heat source to power the activity. Most of the remaining moons of Saturn are small and icy, have no atmospheres and heavily cratered, and have dark ancient surfaces. The moon, Enceladus, however, shows signs of recent geological activity. Some parts of its surface contain 1,000 times fewer craters than other regions, and infrared observations show that its south polar region is unusually warm and venting water and ice containing organic compounds. Evidently, a reservoir of liquid water lies just below the surface. At some point in its history, the moon may have been caught in a resonance with another moon and had its interior warmed by tidal heating. So here we can see Enceladus. Like nearly all moons in the solar system, Saturn's moons are tidally locked to their planet, rotating to keep the same side facing the planet. The leading side of these moons, the side facing forward in orbit, is sometimes modified by debris. For example, Lepidus, for example, has a cratered training side about as bright as dirty snow, but its leading side is as dark as fresh asphalt. One hypothesis is that the dark material is carbon-rich dust from meteoroid impacts on Phoebe, the next moon outward from Saturn, and Lepidus also has a strange equatorial ridge that may have been produced by rapid rotation when the moon was young. So the rings of Saturn are perhaps the most beautiful sight in the solar system. So we have three important ideas in a new term that we need to understand. The first one is the rings are made of billions of ice particles, each in its own orbit around a planet. And the ring particles you observe now can't be as old as Saturn, and the rings must be replenished by impacts on Saturn's icy moons or other processes. And the same is true for the rings around the other Jovian planets. And secondly, the gravitational effects of small moons called shepherd satellites can confine some rings in narrow strands or keep the edges of the ring sharp. So moons can also produce waves in the rings that are visible as tightly wound ringlets. The ring particles are confined in a thin plane spread among small moons and confined by gravitational interactions with larger moons. The rings of Saturn and the rings of the other Jovian worlds are created by and controlled by each planet's moons. Without the moons, there would be no rings. Observations made by the Cassini spacecraft show that the ring particles have compositions that resemble that of Saturn's distant icy moon Phoebe. A large impact on Phoebe may be part of the complex history of Saturn's rings. Tiny ice particles from geysers on the moon Enceladus are understood to be the main source of material for the outermost low-density ring, discovered by the Cassini probe named the E-ring within the Enceladus orbits. Saturn formed in the outer solar nebula, where ice particles were stable and may have contained more trapped gases. The protoplanet grew rapidly and became massive enough to attract hydrogen and helium by gravitational collapse, and the heavier elements sank to the middle to form a small core, and the hydrogen formed a liquid mantle containing liquid metallic hydrogen. The outward flow of heat from the interior drives convection inside a planet that helps produce its magnetic field. Because Saturn is smaller than Jupiter, the internal pressure is less. The planet contains less liquid metallic hydrogen, and its magnetic field is weaker. The rings can't be primordial, that is, they can't be material left over from the formation of the planet. Such ices would have been vaporized and driven away by the heat of the protoplanet. Rather, you can suppose that the rings are debris from the occasional impacts of meteoroids, asteroids, and comets on Saturn's icy moons. Some of Saturn's moons are probably captured asteroids that wandered too close, but the larger moons are almost certainly formed with Saturn. Many of Saturn's moons have ancient surfaces, but Enceladus and Titan have fresh surfaces and evidently ongoing geological activity. And you will see a few more examples of recent geologic activity and also captured moons when you explore further from the Sun. So now we need to talk about Uranus, but Uranus is a bit different than the other planets. Uranus is only 1/3 the diameter of Jupiter and only 1/20th as massive. 4 times further from the Sun than Jupiter, its atmosphere is almost 100 degrees Celsius colder than Jupiter's. Uranus never grew massive enough to capture large amounts of gas from the nebula as Jupiter and Saturn did. So it has much less hydrogen and helium, and its internal pressure is enough less than Jupiter's that it should not contain any liquid metallic hydrogen. And models of Uranus based on part of its density and oblateness suggest that it has a small core of heavy elements and deep mantle of partly solid water. So although the material is referred to as ice, It would not be anything like ice on Earth at the temperatures and pressures inside Uranus. The mantle also probably contains rocky material plus dissolved ammonia and methane. Circulation in that electrically conducting mantle may generate a planet's peculiar magnetic field, and which is highly inclined to its axis of rotation. Above the mantle lies a deep hydrogen and helium atmosphere. So one thing to keep note is Uranus rotates on its side, with its equator inclined at about 98 degrees to its orbit. As a result, the winter-summer contrast is extreme, with the sun passing near each of the planet's celestial poles at the solstice. So half of the planet is in perpetual darkness, and the other half in perpetual light for the 21-year-long summer and winter seasons. So compare that with seasons on Earth. So Voyager 2 flew past it in 1986, and the planet's south pole was pointed almost directly at the sun. So how would you guys feel like if you had a 21-year winter or 21-year summer? So here you can see it, and its axis of rotation is nearly perpendicular. So the Voyager 2 shows a nearly flawless ball. So the atmosphere is mostly hydrogen and helium, but traces of methane absorb red light, and this makes the atmosphere look green-blue. There is no belt zone circulation visible in the Voyager photographs, although computer enhancements reveal a few clouds and bands around the South Pole. So in the decades since Voyager 2 flew past Uranus, spring has come to the northern hemisphere of Uranus and autumn to the southern hemisphere. Images made by the Hubble Space Telescope and new large Earth-based telescopes reveal changing clouds and cloud bands in both hemispheres. So here we can see it, and we can also see that it has rings. So until recently, astronomers could see only 5 moons orbiting Uranus, and Voyager 2 discovered 10 more small moons in 1986, and more have been found in images recorded by powerful telescopes on Earth. The International Astronomical Union, IAU, which decides definitions and naming conventions for celestial objects and surface features, has specified that the moons of Uranus will continue to be named after characters in plays by William Shakespeare and Alexander Pope. So that is quite interesting. So everything in the solar system is named after Greek or Roman mythology, or Greek and Roman mythology rather, except Uranus. It's named after the moons, after characters in William Shakespeare's plays and Alexander Pope's plays, but mostly after William Shakespeare's plays, which is quite interesting. So here we can see evidence of geological activity on the 2 Uranian moons. The one image on top is Ariel, has an old cratered surface, but some regions are marked by broad shallow valleys, a few craters. Image B is Miranda, is marred by ovoids, which are believed to be formed when the internal heating caused slow convection in the ice of the moon's mantle. So Miranda, the innermost moon, is only 14% diameter of Earth's moon, but its surface is marked by grooves called ovoids. And these may have been caused by internal heat driving convection in the icy mantle. Rising currents of ice have deformed the crust and created the ovoids. By counting craters on the ovoids, astronomers conclude that the entire surface is old and the moon is no longer active. Perhaps it was warmed by tidal heating long ago. The rings of Uranus are not easily visible from Earth, and the first hint that Uranus has rings came from occultations, the passing of a planet in front of a star during which the rings momentarily block the star's light, observed by astronomers on board the Kuiper in 1977. Most of what astronomers know about these rings comes from observing by the Voyager 2 spacecraft. Their composition appears to be water ice mixed with methane that has been darkened by exposure to the solar wind particles trapped in the planet's magnetosphere. So notice 3 important points plus 1 new term. The rings of Uranus were discovered during the occultation when Uranus crossed in front of the star. Secondly, the rings are dark, contain little dust, and are confined by small moons. And thirdly, particles orbiting the rings around Uranus and Neptune cannot survive for long periods. So the rings need to be replenished with material from impacts on moons, as is also true for the rings around Jupiter and Saturn. So when you read about Neptune's rings later in this chapter, you will return to this art spread and see how closely the two ring systems compare. In 2006, astronomers found 2 new very faint rings orbiting far outside previously known rings of Uranus. The newly discovered satellite MAB appears to be the source of particles for a larger ring, and the smaller of the new rings is confined between the orbits of the moons Portia and Rosalind. So Uranus never grew massive enough to capture large amounts of gas from the solar nebula as did Jupiter and Saturn. Uranus is rich in water and ice rather than in hydrogen and helium. Modern models of the origin of the solar system suggest that Uranus and Neptune formed closer to the Sun than their present positions. Interactions with massive Jupiter and Saturn could have gradually moved Uranus and Neptune outward, and tidal effects may have produced Uranus' peculiar rotation. Another hypothesis is that Uranus was struck by a large planetesimal as it was forming and given its highly inclined rotation. The highly inclined magnetic field of Uranus may be produced by convection in its electrically conducting mantle. With very little heat flowing out of the interior, this convection must be limited. Now we can talk about Neptune. So Neptune, through a telescope on Earth, Neptune looks like a tiny blue dot with no visible cloud features. In 1989, Voyager 2 flew past and revealed most of what we know today about Neptune. So something interesting I want to ask you guys. How was Neptune discovered? Any ideas? So the one thing is Neptune is the only planet that wasn't discovered by observations. So mathematical calculations was made by studying the other planets and the gravity of our solar system. And it was determined that there has to be a body the size of Neptune at a certain point in our solar system, and astronomers calculated where that point was. And when they pointed telescopes to that location, boom, there was Neptune. So the Neptune wasn't discovered through a telescope, but Neptune was rather predicted through math. So almost exactly the same size as Uranus, Neptune has a similar interior. Model calculations predict that a small core of heavy elements lie within the slushy mantle of water ices and rocky materials below a hydrogen-rich atmosphere. Yet Neptune looks quite different on the outside from Uranus. So Neptune is dramatically blue and has active cloud formations. Neptune's dark tint is caused by atmospheric composition of 1.5 times more methane than Uranus. And methane absorbs red photons better than blue and scatters blue photons better than red, giving Neptune a color and Uranus a green-blue color. So atmospheric circulation on Neptune is much more dramatic than that on Uranus. And Voyager 2 flew past Neptune in 1989. The largest feature was the Great Dark Spot, roughly the size of Earth. and the spots seem to be an atmospheric circulation pattern, much like Jupiter's red spot. So here we can see the Great Dark Spot, which is you can think about it as a tropical storm. So the atmospheric activity on Neptune is apparently driven by heat flowing from the interior plus contribution by dim sunlight 30 AUs from the sun. So the heat causes convection in the atmosphere, which the rapid rotation of the planet converts into high-speed winds. High-level white clouds of methane ice crystals and rotating storms are visible as spots. And Neptune may have more activity than Uranus because it has more heat flowing out of its interior for reasons that are still unclear. Neptune has 2 moons that were discovered from Voyager discovered from Earth before Voyager 2 flew past in 1989, and Voyager discovered 6 more very small moons. Since then, a few more small moons have been found by astronomers using Earth-based telescopes. So with a surface temperature of 36 Kelvin, that in Fahrenheit is wrong. Triton has an atmosphere of nitrogen and methane, about 10 to the power 5 times less dense than Earth's. A significant part of Triton is ice, and deposits of nitrogen frost are visible on the southern pole, which at the time Voyager 2 flew past had been turned towards sunlight for 30 years. The nitrogen frost appears to be vaporized in the sunlight and is probably refreezing in the darkness of Triton's north pole. So Neptune also has rings. So comparing the rings of Neptune with those of Uranus, we can add 2 more points that we need to understand. So the first thing is Neptune's rings, named after the astronomers involved in the discovery of the planet, are similar to those of Uranus but contain more small dust particles. And then also, Neptune's rings show another way that moons can interact with rings. One of Neptune's moons is producing short arcs in the outermost ring. So the last things we need to talk about is Pluto and the Kuiper Belt. So out on the edge of the solar system orbits a family of small icy worlds, and Pluto was the first to be discovered. You may have learned in school that there are 9 planets in our solar system, but in 2006, the IAU voted to remove Pluto from the list of planets and reclassify it as a dwarf planet. So Pluto is very small icy world. It isn't a Jovian and it isn't a terrestrial. It orbits, it's highly inclined and elliptical, enough that Pluto occasionally comes closer to the Sun than Neptune at times. And to understand Pluto's status, you can use comparative planetology to analyze Pluto and then compare it with its neighbors. So Pluto is very difficult to observe from Earth. Its diameter is 2,370 kilometers, smaller than Australia, and only 2/3 the diameter of Earth's moon. In Earth-based telescopes, Pluto never looks like more than a faint point of light. And even in Hubble Space Telescope images, it shows little detail. Orbiting so far from the Sun, Pluto is cold enough to freeze most compounds, and you can think of it as gases. Spectroscopic observations have found evidence of nitrogen and methane ices on its surface. So Pluto has a thin atmosphere of nitrogen and carbon monoxide with small amounts of methane. Pluto has 5 known moons. 4 are quite small, but Charon is relatively large, with half of Pluto's diameter. So Charon orbits Pluto in an orbit inclined at 118 degrees to the plane of Pluto's orbit around the Sun, which means Charon's motion is retrograde. Pluto and Charon are tidally locked facing each other, so Pluto's axis of rotation is inclined at the same large angle to its orbit, such as rotation is also retrograde. Knowing Charon's orbital period of 6.4 days and orbit semi-major axis of 19,600 kilometers, so retrograde, so look back at one of our early lectures, I think this was lecture 4 we talk about retrograde. So retrograde motion in a night sky is as it appears moving backwards. And speaking about these planets, a moment ago we talked about prograde and retrograde motion. So prograde motion is everything is moving anti-clockwise, but prograde is it moves clockwise. So that means it's also spinning counterclockwise on its own axis. Sorry, the other way around. So when speaking about it, prograde is anti-clockwise and retrograde is clockwise. Sorry, it spins clockwise around its own orbit. Sorry about that. So knowing that we can calculate it as 0.0024 Earth masses. So most of that mass is Pluto, which has about 9 times the mass of Charon. Knowing the diameters and masses of Pluto and Charon allows to determine their densities, respectively 1.9 and 1.7 grams per cubic centimeters. That indicates that both Pluto and Charon must contain about 30 to 40% ice and 60 to 70% rock. The New Horizons spacecraft flew past Pluto in July 2015, radioing back impressive images and other measurements. So close-up pictures show mountains up to 3.5 kilometers high. Methane and hydrogen ice would not be strong enough to stand that tall. So planetary scientists conclude that the mountains must be made of water ice that would be rock hard at Pluto's temperature. The lack of craters and near those mountains indicates that this peculiar landscape is very young, no older than 100 million years, and one of the youngest surfaces observed in the solar system. So Pluto have been active geologically recently, which means that its heat must be flowing outward. Although planetary scientists wonder what the internal heat source could be, Charon's orbit is perfectly circular, so tidal heating is not the explanation. Radioactive decay would seem to be the only plausible alternative, although that heat source should also have faded long ago. One planetary scientist on the New Horizons team remarked, this may cause us to rethink what powers geological activity on many other icy worlds. So Pluto turns out to be a world full of surprises. To understand why Pluto is no longer considered a planet, you should recall what you have already learned about the Kuiper Belt. Since 1992, astronomers have discovered more than 1,000 icy bodies orbiting beyond Neptune. And these may be as many as 100 million Kuiper Belt objects larger than 1 kilometer in diameter. They are understood to be icy planetesimals left over from the outer solar nebula, and some of the Kuiper Belt objects are quite large. And one, Eris, has about the same diameter as Pluto, but is 27% more massive. 3 other Kuiper Belt objects so far, Centaur and Quaoar, are half the size of Pluto or larger, and Eris, Quaoar, and Orcus are known to have moons of their own. So in that way, they resemble Pluto and its family of moons. A bit comparative planetology shows that Pluto is not related to the Jovian or terrestrial planets. It is obviously a member of a newfound family of worlds that orbit beyond Neptune. These bodies must have formed at about the same time as the 8 classical planets in the solar system. but it did not grow massive enough to clear their orbital zones of remnant planetesimals and consequently remained embedded among a swarm of other objects in the Kuiper Belt. The IAU's criteria for full planet status is that an object must be large enough that its gravity has pulled it into a spherical shape, and also large enough to dominate and gravitationally clear its orbit region of most of all other objects over a span of billions of years. Eris and Pluto, the largest objects found in the Kuiper Belt, and Ceres, the largest object in the asteroid belt, are too small to clear their orbital zones of other objects and therefore do not meet the standard for being called a planet. On the other hand, all three are large enough to be spherical, so they are the prototypes of a new class of objects that are defined by the IAU as dwarf planets. So now we can talk Pluto and the Plotinos. And no, the section is not about the 1950s rock band. It's about the history of the outer solar system. And will take you back 4.6 billion years to watch the planets form. More than 100 of the Kuiper Belt objects are caught with Pluto in a 3:2 resonance with Neptune. That is, they orbit the Sun twice while Neptune orbits 3 times. The subset of Kuiper Belt objects have been named Plotinos. The Plotinos formed in the outer solar nebula, but how they get caught in resonance with Neptune. As you learned earlier, some models of the formation of the planet suggest that Uranus and Neptune may have migrated outward early in the solar system's history. As Neptune moved further from the Sun, its orbital resonances could have swept up small objects like a kind of planetary snowplow, and the Plotinos are caught in the 3:2 resonance, and other Kuiper Belt objects are caught in other resonances. And the evidence appears to support those models that predict that Uranus and Neptune migrated outward. The migration of the outer planets would have dramatically upset the motion of some of these Kuiper Belt objects, and some could have been thrown inward where they could interact with the Jovian planets. Some of those objects may have been captured as moons, and astronomers wonder if moons such as Neptune's Triton could have started life as Kuiper Belt objects. Other objects may have hit bodies in the inner solar system and caused the late heavy bombardment episode, especially evident on the surface of Earth's moon. And the small frozen worlds on the fringes of the solar system may hold clues to the formation of the planets 4.6 billion years ago and the subsequent history of Earth. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is today's lecture on the outer solar system. So we can now start with the next set of lecture slides. So let's take a quick 5-minute break before we start. Okay, so we can start. So question, what is the total for the exam? That is actually a good question. I still need to set the exam paper. Let's see if I can look at one of the, let's see if I can look at last year's exam and I can see, tell you what it counted. And what did it count? So it's going to be 30 for the multiple choice. So it should be around about 75 marks. It's 75, it should be around about 75 marks. So question, so for the moon assignment, why do we need to measure the distance of the moon to certain objects? Is this make the sketch the observation, then to calculate the diameter? Or doesn't seem we need two distances to calculate? It depends on what method you are using to calculate the diameter of the moon. So it all depends on the method you're using. So hopefully that answers your question. So just a quick question, can we do in-text referencing? Yes, you can do in-text referencing as well. But remember, if you do in-text referencing, you still need to have a proper bibliography at the end. So the next thing we need to talk about today is meteorites, asteroids, and comets. So what would you guys say this is? This is an asteroid. And the tell signs that this is asteroid is because it's melted. So most of the asteroids contain iron in them. And that's something we will learn about. So these are some of the biggest asteroids in the asteroid belt. So here we can see the big one, Rosetta, is about 132 by 101 by 76 kilometers. So this asteroid, if you put it in perspective, is bigger than Gauteng, which is a large object and quite amazing. And what is this? That's a comet, yes. So comets are very beautiful objects that we can observe. So we have studied everything so far in the solar system, but in our solar system, the only thing now that remains is what is asteroids, meteors, and comets. So asteroids or comets are unevolved objects, leftover planet construction bricks, if you may, and you will find them much as they were when they formed 4.6 billion years ago. Meteors and meteorites are fragments of comets and asteroids that arrive at Earth and can give you a close look at those ancient planetesimals. So I'm going to read through the slides on your own time. I'm only going to highlight some of the most important parts. So the first thing is, where do meteors and meteorites come from? What are asteroids? What are comets? And what happens when asteroid and comets hits Earth and or other planets? So one afternoon in 1954, Mrs. E. Hewlett Hodges of Alabama lay napping on a living room couch, and an explosion and a sharp pain jolted her awake. Analysis of the brick-sized rock that smashed through the ceiling and bruised the left leg showed that it was a meteorite. Mrs. Hodges is the only person known to have been injured by a meteorite. Coincidentally, she lived right across the street from the Comet Drive-In Theater. Meteorites arrive from space all over the Earth every day, although not as spectacular as the one that struck Mrs. Hodges. You learn in this chapter that meteorites are fragments of asteroids, and that asteroids are, well as their icy cousins, the comets, carry precious clues about the condition of the solar nebula, from which the sun and planets formed. Because you cannot easily visit comets and asteroids, you can begin by learning about the pieces of those bodies that came to you. So if you've learned things about meteorites in chapter 15, section 2, when you studied evidence for the age of the solar system, and there you saw that a solar system includes small particles called meteoroids, and some of them collide with Earth atmospheres with speeds of 10 to 70 kilometers per second. Friction with air heats the meteoroids enough so that they glow, and you see them vaporize as streaks across the night sky. And those streaks are called meteors or shooting stars. If a meteoroid is big enough and holds together well enough, it can survive and plunge through the atmosphere and reach Earth's surface. Once the object strikes surface, it's called a meteorite, with I-T-E being Greek root for rock. If you will learn later in this chapter, the largest of those objects can blast out craters on Earth's surface. But such big impacts are extremely rare. The great majority of meteorites are too small to form craters. So what can meteorites and meteors tell you about the origin of the solar system? To answer that question, you can consider the composition of their orbits. One of the best places to look for meteorites turns out to be certain parts of Antarctica. The nearest Earth rocks are buried under miles of ice, so any rock you find there must have fallen from space. The slow flow of the Antarctic ice cap towards the ocean concentrates meteorites in areas where the moving ice runs into mountain barriers, slows down and evaporates. So teams of scientists in Antarctica and ride snowmobiles in systematic sweeps across the ice, each southern hemisphere, summer to meteorites. After 25 years' work, more than half of 40,000 meteorites in humanity's possession are from Antarctica. So here we can see scientists collecting some of these meteorites in Antarctica. So meteorites can be divided into three broad composition categories. Iron meteorites are solid chunks of iron and nickel. Stony meteorites are mixtures of iron and stone. And stony meteorites are silicate masses that resemble earth rock. And carbonaceous chondrites are a special type of stony objects. So here we can see the different types of meteorites. So a typical meteoroid has roughly the mass of a paperclip and vaporizes at an altitude of about 80 kilometers above Earth's surface. The meteor trail points back along the path of the meteoroid. So if you study the direction and speed of the meteors, you can get clues to their orbits in the solar system before they encountered Earth. One way to backtrack meteor trails is to observe meteor showers. On any clear night, you can see 3 to 15 meteors per hour. But on some nights, you can see a shower of hundreds of meteors per hour that are obviously related to each other, seeming to come from a single area in the sky called the radiant of the shower. Meteor showers are named after the constellation from which they seem to radiate. For example, the Perseid shower seen in mid-August radiates from the constellation Perseus. The fact that the meteors in a shower appear to come from a single point in the sky means that the meteoroids were actually traveling through space along parallel paths. And you see the fiery tracks through Earth's atmosphere in perspective. So they appear to come from a single radiant point, just as a parallel railroad tracks seem to come from a single point in the horizon. So when we get a meteor shower, that is when we have an orbit of a comet around Earth, around the sun, and then Earth goes through the path of that comet and goes through the particles it leaves behind. So here we can see orbits of these and where these meteoroids comes from and how it was created. So the origin of meteorites tells us a large planetesimal can't keep its internal heat long enough to differentiate. Then collisions break up the layers of the different composition meteorites from near the surface are rocky, and meteorites deeper in the planetesimal were heated to higher temperatures. So fragments from near the core might have been melted entirely. And fragments of the iron core can fall to the Earth as iron meteorites. So what are some properties of asteroids? So asteroids are distant objects too small to study in detail with Earth-based telescopes. And astronomers nevertheless have learned a surprising amount about those little worlds using spacecraft and space telescopes. So evidence from meteorites show that the asteroids are the last remains of the rocky planetesimals that builded terrestrial planets 4.6 billion years ago. So notice 4 important points and 3 new terms. Most asteroids are irregular in shape and battered by impact cratering, and many asteroids seem to be rubble piles of broken fragments. Secondly, some asteroids are double objects or have small moons in orbit around them. This is further evidence that asteroids have suffered collisions. Thirdly, a few asteroids show signs of geological activity that probably happened on their surfaces when those asteroids were young. And then fourthly, asteroids can be classified by their albedos, colors, and spectra to try to reveal clues to their compositions. This also allows them to be compared to meteorites in labs on Earth. So C-type, S-type, and N-type asteroids are the main classes discovered by this method. The first asteroid was discovered in 1801 by the Sicilian monk Giuseppe Piazzi and later named Ceres. And astronomers were excited by Piazzi's discovery because Ceres orbits 2.8 AU from the Sun in a wide gap between Mars and Jupiter, where it thought a planet ought to be. But Ceres has less than 1/4 diameter of Earth's moon, much smaller than any of the planets. And 3 even smaller objects, Pallas, Juno, and Vesta, were discovered within a few years, all orbiting between Mars and Jupiter. So astronomers decided that Ceres and the other asteroids could not be considered true planets. So you learn in chapter 18, section 6, that Ceres, the largest object in the asteroid belt, has now been reclassified as a dwarf planet because it has enough gravitational strength to squeeze it into a spherical shape, but not enough to have swept up and cleared away the rest of the asteroids. So today there are more than 400,000 asteroids have well-charted orbits. Other than the dwarf planet Ceres, only 3 are larger than 400 kilometers in diameter. Most are much smaller. They are probably 1 million or more that are larger than 1 kilometer in diameter. And astronomers are sure that the large asteroids in the asteroid belt have been discovered, but are also sure that many small asteroids remain undiscovered. So movies and TV has created a common misconception that flying through an asteroid belt is a hair-raising plunge requiring constant dodging left and right. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter is actually most empty space. In fact, if you were standing on an asteroid, it would be many months or years until sightings of other asteroids. So several of these asteroids are identified as near-Earth objects, or NEOs, which could potentially hit Earth. And the most dangerous types of NEOs, those with orbits that crosses Earth's orbit, are called Apollo objects, after the first such asteroid discovered. So the combined searches are estimated to have found at least 93% of Apollos and other NEOs larger than 1 kilometer in diameter, and are now focused on finding a similar percentage of objects down to the size of about 150 meters. In March 2009, a NEO searcher spotted a small asteroid, so 2 to 3 meters in diameter, about the size of a small truck on a collision course with Earth. The astronomers were able to observe it in space before impact and discovered that its color and albedo matched a type of asteroid found mostly in the outer belt. So the asteroid entered Earth's atmosphere over the desert of the northern Sudan and exploded, and scientists from the United States and Sudan searched for pieces of the object. So question, since Ceres was once considered a planet, but later reclassified, could any other object in the asteroid belt ever be reclassified in the future based on new discoveries? Yes, it can. So it won't be reclassified as objects as we know it now. So if it is reclassified, it will most likely be reclassified as a different kind of asteroid. But no, it won't be ever reclassified as a planet, if that makes sense. So here we can see the asteroids in the main belt. So this diagram plots the positions of known asteroids between the Sun and the orbit of Jupiter on a specific day. And most asteroids are in the main belt. So squares are filled or empty show the location of known comets. Although asteroids and comets are small bodies and lie far apart, there are a great many of them in the inner solar system. So here is the team leader of the Faculty of Physics and Science of the University of Khartoum in the meteor astronomer Peter Jenkins of the Carl Sagan Center at SETI Institute posed with the first fragments found of the small asteroid that exploded over the Sudanese desert in March 2009. So there are other non-belt asteroids beyond the main belt. Gravitational effects of Jupiter and the Sun combine to trap two groups of asteroids in Lagrange points that are 60 degrees ahead and 60 degrees behind the planet in its orbit. These are called Trojan asteroids because individual objects have been named after heroes of the Trojan War. So astronomers have also found new objects in the Lagrange point of orbits of Mars and Neptune. So something also to take note is that Jupiter protects us much from asteroids. Because of its gravitational pull, it would rather capture asteroids, which will make them, like we said, Trojan asteroids. So we can think about Jupiter as the big brother that actually protects us from most asteroids. So the object Churon, found in 1977, is about 170 kilometers in diameter, and its orbit carries it from the orbit of Uranus to just inside the orbit of Saturn. And objects like Churon, with orbits between or crossing orbits of the Jovian planets, are called centaurs. Although it was first classified as an asteroid, Churon later surprised astronomers by suddenly releasing jets of vapor and dust. You will learn in the next section that this more resembles a characteristic of comets than asteroids. And centaurs show that a distinction between asteroids and comets is not clear-cut. So as technology allows astronomers to detect smaller and more distant objects, they are learning that our solar system contains large numbers of these small bodies, and the challenge is to explain their origin. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are going to call it today. So tomorrow I will see you in class. So if our planning goes correctly, tomorrow will also be our last class for the semester. So I will see you all tomorrow. I will also log off immediately. Unfortunately, I have another appointment. So I noticed that the assignment due date changed. What is the assignment due date now? Yes, it was 26. I've kept the assignment due date at 26. That is correct. Okay, cool. So I have another appointment, unfortunately, at 4:15. So I also have to log off. So have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow in class.